Okie doke. We're going to get rolling and hopefully, fingers crossed, end a little bit early today. So, is there a football game or anything like that going on? Oh, sorry. Thank you for making the sacrifice, Linda. Are you recording it or are you watching it on demand or something? Okay, great. A couple of quick notes. I was at Bishop's convocation this week, which is it is what it is. It was at the beach. That was wonderful. But one of the good things that came out of it is I was inspired about a couple of ideas for next topics. And so I have already determined that this will end by the end of December. So this ends beginning of the new year. I don't know if we'll start in January because generally January is semi-annual meeting prep, budget prep, all that stuff. I might do like a short 3-week something or other. But the topic that I want to do from essentially Epiphany, almost Lent-ish, and it might go past Easter, is a foundational understanding of discipleship. Okay, that sounds weighty and it sounds like something we've already done. But I have this thought, which is that, okay, so if I say discipleship to you all, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Love your neighbor.
Bonhoeffer, love your neighbor. Catechism, is anybody thinking like, another catechism study, right? We did, I think I maybe did something that had discipleship in the title a while back. I don't know. It all runs together. But here was my thought. I was thinking it might be fun to create a picture of discipleship in class based solely on what the apostles' experience of discipleship looks like in the Gospels. So in other words, what we'll do is we'll go through, the work that I'll do is probably kind of like compiling the 4 Gospels together, right? But we'll essentially walk through call of the disciples all the way up through like the end of the Galilean ministry. And then we'll talk about resurrection stuff as well too, but talk about, based on this, what does being a follower of Jesus look like, right? That's my idea. We'll see. I'll start prep on it in December and we'll see what pans out. I thought it might be fun.
Do we have to get rid of all our property and stuff?
Yep. No, that's discipleship based on Book of Acts, which will be part 2. That's when I ask you to donate all your money to my private pastoral fund.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the part where they knock on people's doors with their scrolls in hand.
Yes.
Like that's gotta be in there
Where
somewhere.
the door knocking part, that's in Paul's letter to the suburbanites. Right? Yeah, I never found the door knocking part either. I couldn't find that one in scripture. Okay, let's get back to biblical law. Yeah. So last week we spent the majority of our time talking about murder and honoring your parents and how those 2 things, believe it or not, seem to be related in the Mosaic law, considering that the punishment is the same. So today my goal is to kind of finish looking at violence, but then to get into property, because this is where, for me at least, it gets really really interesting for several reasons. We'll get to that. Okay. So last week we had a fantastic conversation around honoring your father and mother, and we were talking about, okay, in the Mosaic law, so in Exodus 21, whoever either strikes or curses father and mother shall be put to death. We talked about how that is perhaps an interpretation, an application of Exodus 20, 10 Commandments, which just simply says, honor your father and mother. And how this was probably contextual to this society. We talked about how that contrasts with that same kind of parent-child dynamic as it exists in our modern context, right? We talked about how those things differ, especially with regards to, you know, in our modern context, the weight of care exists primarily on the side of the child, you know, protecting children. I was just having a conversation with somebody about Bonhoeffer yesterday, and Bonhoeffer has that great conversation around truth-telling, right? Which I've harped on. You guys are probably sick of hearing about this, but the metaphor that one of the metaphors that he uses is talking about the child that comes to school who has visible signs of abuse. And the teacher asks the child, you know, what, or not what, but is your dad beating you, right? Is your dad abusing you? And the question that Bonhoeffer proposes is, what does telling the truth for this child look like, considering, you know, the following complications? Perhaps if he says, yes, my dad's beating me, that will result in more punishment. Perhaps, you know, and again, this is 1930s Germany, in a crumbling economy, perhaps the father being the sole source of income for the family. If dad gets picked up for child abuse, that means mom and kids starve, right? Perhaps the child, despite abuse, still loves dad, which is a complication that exists in systems of abuse all the time. So Bonhoeffer asks, what is truth-telling in that case? Is it truthful for the child to say, no, I'm not, my dad's not beating me, I fell? Is that telling the truth? Because in that case, and you know, this comes from Bonhoeffer's kind of foundational, being a person of free responsibilities, that telling the truth means telling the thing that is truthful with regards to the people you're responsible for. You know, he tells a similar, or he gives a similar, you know, scenario where a family sheltering Jews during Kristallnacht has SS knock on the door. Are there Jews in this house? Is it lying for the family to say no? No, you know. And so he's saying that actually telling the truth in that scenario is saying no, there are no Jews here because they have a greater responsibility to the well-being of this family they're sheltering, as well as the consequences of that. So the reason I bring this up is that we didn't get into that last week, but that was also part of the conversation. And that's part of the conversation whenever we talk about things like laws, is we're wondering, we're including in this who is affected by and who the law is responsible to, right? And this is kind of the picture that we're trying to build as we go along reading here, is also kind of trying to suss out who benefits from this, who is being protected by this, and who is being left out of the thinking, right? So honor the father and mother. Whoever strikes the father and mother shall be put to death. Last week, you know, we discussed that this really seems to be protecting the father and the mother, and does not seem to be taking into account necessarily the well-being of the child. But, you know, again, the question there is, but what are the mechanisms within that society that function to protect the children? Are there social constructs? Are there societal pieces that are there for the protection of children? Is that something that's just assumed, right? That children are valued and therefore you wouldn't harm them? But an interesting question to bring into it then is like, well, what do we do with, for example, the sacrifice of Isaac, right? So God demands of Abraham, come up and kill your child, you know, which that's a much longer conversation, one that we've talked about before, because theoretically Abraham would say, I know that as a good Hebrew person, child sacrifice is not part of our practice, right? But that's not necessarily what happens. So, you know, again, what is the value of the life of a child within this system? And how does the way that we value children in our modern system affect that? So I just kind of wanted to put that out there as something to keep in mind. Who is involved in this and who is being left out of these conversations as we read through this?
I had a thought from last
Go,
week.
Carolyn.
What if the father is hurting the mother and the child intercedes?
That is a wonderful thought. What if the father is abusing the mother, the child intercedes, steps in, strikes the father, stands between the father and the mother? Well, according to this, it's pretty clean cut.
Yep.
pretty clean cut. And this is a really important wondering, because it also begs the question of, well, it says whoever honors father and mother, but who comes first, father and mother in the society? And with regards to how women were valuated, generally probably the male. Yeah.
Well, we've got the story of Noah when his kid catches Noah
Ham.
up to no good.
Yeah.
The kid's in trouble for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Ham uncovers his father's nakedness, whatever that means. What was Noah up to? Yeah. Who else was involved in that? Yeah, and Ham, and it's the curse of Ham, right? That gets leveraged upon him. So we're going to read through the rest of this little short section, this very joyful section. So verse 18. When individuals quarrel, still 21 for Exodus, sorry. When individuals quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or a fist, so that the injured party, though not dead, is confined to bed, but recovers and walks around outside with the help of a staff, then the assailant shall be free of liability, except to pay for the loss of time and to arrange for full recovery. I find this stuff fascinating. So, two dudes get in a fight, one gets the worst end of it. So long as he recovers on his own, the winner, arguably, of the argument just has to pay for the loss of time. Okay, bookmark that one. However, and this is my however, it's not in the text. However, when a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. Punished how? But if the slave survives for a day or two, what is it? 1 day, 2 days, 3 days? There is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. Oh, oof. How do we feel about that one? Yeah, that doesn't feel good at all, does it? That does not feel good at all. When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage and yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judge determines. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. So, woman's pregnant, she gets injured, she gets caught in the crossfire of two guys flexing their testosterone muscles, and gets harmed, loses the baby. It's a fine for the baby, but if the woman gets killed, then the one responsible for killing the woman gets killed. Now, here's my question about this, though. If she wasn't the intended victim, she was merely collateral damage, I thought that didn't mean murder. I thought that meant, a fine or something like that. He gets to go to the altar, prove that it is it wasn't premeditated. It was an act of unfortunate consequence. Right? What's going on here? I don't know. I wonder, though, if because the woman was innocent in this fight, if that carries weight. And finally, when a slave owner strikes the eye of a male or female slave, destroying it, the owner shall let the slave go, a free person, to compensate for the eye. If the owner knocks a tooth out of a male or female slave, the slave shall be let go, a free person, to compensate for the tooth. Now hold on. Hold on here. This does not at all seem to vibe with verse 20. So, if a slave owner beats their slave, but there apparently is no loss of limb or eye or tooth, as long as they recover, it's fine. But if they die, the slave owner is punished. But if you beat them so badly that they lose a limb or an eye, you have to set them free. Does anybody else feel like maybe perhaps these laws came about from different places? I don't know. And again, the fact that they're listed a couple of verses apart, they're not listed in consecutive order, makes me wonder. And the reason I bring this up is, for me, this kind of reinforces the the nature of what we're reading here, which is that these are definitely sets of codes of laws that are all about how you kind of apply perhaps these other sets of, what we refer to as the Ten Commandments. So it's all about how you apply this kind of ideal sense of the law, but in specific circumstances. And again, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time analyzing the what's and wherefores of this, or necessarily the psychology behind it. But I do want to encourage us to wonder about, okay, if this is stuff that's dealing with applying this overall kind of idea to specific circumstances, what does that say about who is putting these laws together? What does that say about who this is? And again, I'm repeating myself, but it just, for me at least, further justifies that when we read stuff like this, we always keep in mind that this, we always leave ourselves open to the idea that perhaps this is not directly the word of God concerning how to treat slaves. You with me on that? Okay. Let's talk about property. Speaking of slaves, we go on to property, which, notice, and this is, again, these headers that we have in our scripture are not headers that exist in the Hebrew text. They are put in by the people who write the NRSV and later stuff. But in the Code of Hammurabi, in the Code of Ur-Nammu and Lipit Ishtar, slaves fall under the property heading. But apparently there seems to be an intentional separation. Slaves in this case, or at least the abuse thereof, falls under violence with other human beings. I'm just going to read through this whole section, and then if there's anything that comes up, we can deal with it. But then otherwise, move on. When an ox goes, pause. Keep in the back of your minds what the other codes said, and if you've got them in front of them, great. In front of you, fantastic. If not, we can go back and go. But they're not all that dissimilar, believe it or not. When an ox gores a man or woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall not be liable. Okay, real quick, let's put on the brakes here. What's up with this? The flesh of the ox shall not be eaten. What might be the motivation behind this? What?
That the ox might have been having a disease that caused it?
That's an interesting thought. That's not where I was leading us, which I'm sorry for doing that, for asking a question that minute. But that's a really interesting thought, that perhaps the ox, can oxen get rabies? That's a really interesting question. But yeah, perhaps it was disease. Mad cow disease. That's great.
But the meat can't be sold.
The meat cannot be sold. Yep. The meat cannot be sold. You cannot profit off of tragedy, right? Is another piece that's in here, which you will see come back in. But I really like that disease piece. The other thing that I had thought as well is that, considering the intensity with which the Hebrew people regarded blood and cleanliness, that this is an animal who has contaminated itself by blood, therefore you shall not eat the flesh of that animal. That was another thought that we had. Thank you, that's great. Okay. But the owner shall not be liable. However, if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, this is a gorer, and its owner has been warned but has not restrained it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. Whoa. Stone the ox, stone the owner. If a ransom is imposed on the owner, then the owner shall pay whatever is imposed for the redemption of the victim's life.
But if he's dead, how's he going to do that?
That's a really good question.
I think it means if under other circumstances there's a
Yeah.
ransom about this kind of
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah, and again, this may just be an editorial issue. There may have been, there may be an assumption here, which is that somebody is gored but doesn't die, right? Or
How about just compensating their family
Yeah, could be. Yeah, that's a really great thought. It could be compensating the family as well. Although, well, so you're taking the money from the estate of the man to be executed. I don't know, but I wonder as well if this is like one of those things where let me put it this way: how do you establish a previous case of goring? And whether or not this ox is a known gorer of human beings. Again, where there's probably not any legal record of it, it's mostly hearsay by neighbors, right? So similar to, if a child strikes his father, who's it up to determine whether the execution is carried out? In this case, this might be that gray area in the middle where, this bull may have done, or this ox may have been involved in violence in the past, but it wasn't necessarily Jerry's fault. He's just really bad at tying knots, and the ox got free type thing. And so let's establish a penalty rather than killing our neighbor Jerry, who we like, but his ox is a jerk. That type of thing. Yeah, I don't know. That's my idea, Matt.
You guys wonder how much work it took to stone the ox?
Oh my goodness. Those things, yeah, right? And what are they using? What kind of stones are they using here? And at what point did they just say, you know what, somebody just get the sword, or somebody just get the, yeah, I know. Stoning an ox to death is like, yeah.
It's not that hard.
You don't think so?
No, you just bring the ox down to the edge of the cliff.
Creative application of ancient biblical execution laws. Yeah, if you stone them near a cliff, they'll fall off. Boy, we're live streaming this. Well, hey, your brains are going the exact same place mine is, so I don't feel bad.
Well, I'm not gonna tell you how they kill cattle. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I've seen it. Yeah. They didn't have the air guns. Yeah, there was a lot of that. Well, and especially because you would need to drain the blood from the animal as well too. So yeah, which that will, when we get to ritual cleanliness, that comes up. Sorry, verse 31. If it gores a boy or a girl, and again, pay careful attention to the distinction here. The owner shall be dealt with according to this same rule. If the ox gores a male or female slave, the owner shall pay to the slave owner 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. What does it mean, dealt with according to the same rule? Does it mean that if a boy or if a child is killed, then the ox and the owner are killed? Or does it mean that there's a fine levied? What's the same rule here? And I encourage you to think about it, because why is there a separate line for children? Okay. It might not have been the same. It might not have been the same. And again, second millennia, or well, 1.5 millennia BCE, the things we have to keep in mind are life expectancy of children, infant and child mortality rates super high. And I'm overstating this, I'm sure, but this, what we're seeing here is that children were viewed differently than fully fledged human beings, at least according to the legal code. All of these things factor into that. You're lucky if half your kids make it to adulthood, and even the ones that do make it to adulthood are likely going to die in inter-tribal violence, or fighting the Babylonians or whoever. But that factors into how these people govern themselves. In 2022, where we're continuing to watch infant and child mortality rates decline, we have set a different valuation on the well-being of children, infants, and the unborn. And I would argue, actually, that we value the lives of children, not just with regards to abortion, but even with other stuff. We value the lives of children higher than adults. For example, a school shooting. Awful. And this is not going to be a gun control conversation, although we could have that too if you want. There are how many different school shootings that have happened over the past, Yeah. Is anybody aware of the murder rate in Chicago? And that it's been increasing every year.
Well, look at Portland.
Is anybody aware of the murder rate in Portland? And that's been increasing every year. Now, our legal codes might not necessarily make that distinction, but how we as public react to that is obviously different. We are more grieved by the loss of children than we are by the loss of adults. Now, there's other stuff that factors in here, right? Skin color, economic class, gang violence, all kinds of things factor into this. And this is not about beating us over the heads with it. It's just about us understanding how we value stuff and how our laws respond to that, reflect that. Because we're seeing in this society how they value stuff. And this is important because when we talk about something like a Christian ethic or a Christian perspective, or how a Christian belief system would inform our law codes, we also have to be honest with ourselves that that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a biblically informed thing. Okay? It's not that we're ignoring the Bible, but that when we, if you polled, right? If you did a quick poll of American Christianity in all of its forms, regarding this similar kind of thing, and I don't have the poll question that comes to mind, but how we value the loss of a child's life, or how we value that, I would probably argue that a lot of people would say the same thing that we're saying here, which is that yes, we absolutely value, maybe more highly, the value of a child's life for lots of reasons, cultural reasons, innocence, right? Child hasn't done anything to deserve it yet, So, and again, there are reasons why we do this. And if you ask those same folks, us included, does your Christian faith inform that decision? Everybody would probably say yes. You think? Paul, you're shaking your head no.
No, I think that it's more organic, more hormonal.
Mm.
I'm just impressed with motherhood and babies and even granddaddy.
Oh, yeah.
Is gosh, is it ever this huge tug in our hearts?
Yeah.
And I think that's fairly universal. I don't know that has much to do with Jesus particularly. Although, there again, the text we didn't get to right after the Luke 18, suffer the little children.
Yeah.
Yet, the little children, screw them.
They're not even named.
Yeah,
They're not even
exactly.
named. And maybe I'm phrasing, maybe I'm putting words into our mouths here, and I am, intentionally so. But what I'm trying to get at is that we so often just kind of assume that our values as a society and as a culture come from these mysterious biblical roots, right? And that is so often used as justification then for other things. We go back and we pull something out of Leviticus and we say, well, right here, this is why it is this way. What I'm trying to point out is that, in fact, so much of what we value, and I'm not in any way critiquing what we value, by the way, right? I'm not saying that valuing children over and above adult lives is wrong. It's an interesting conversation to have. I'm just saying, let's be honest about where it comes from, right?
Yeah.
Because then when we, as Christians, as those in a journey of discipleship trying to follow Jesus, when we make a claim on something, I would argue that we also need to be very sure, right? When we say, well, this is what Jesus would want, that we're able to go back and say, well, here's where Jesus says that, right? Or if we say, well, this is what the Bible says, we need to be really sure that that's actually what what's in the Bible. But then also, since the Bible has all this other weird stuff in it, about slaves and their well-being, we need to be able to be realistic about what that says as well. Sorry, I'm getting really preachy here. I apologize.
Age limit involved in this?
Is there an age limit?
Because Linda has a boy and a girl.
Yeah.
But they're 51 and 47.
Yeah.
Does that still apply
I mean, that's a really good question, Linda. And I think we should take it up with they were not obviously really good at specificity regarding this. But, an interesting thing to wonder is, what was the age of adulthood? How did they determine it? And was it something that was assumed in society, right? Because it wasn't last week, right? We asked, what's the age at which you have your bar mitzvah? 15, 13, 13, right? That might be the marker of adulthood in terms of separating a child from an adult in case of the law.
Well, in answer to that, and along with what Paul said, as a mother, your child is always your child.
Yes.
And there's always, you want to protect them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And all these people that have been killed on the streets of Portland, they have mothers.
They have mothers too, and grandmothers. They're somebody's grandbaby.
But
Yeah.
smaller children need protection.
Sure. And that factors into it as well too. I mean, because it's in this. Widows, orphans, foreigners, people that are not normally protected in society have special protection according to the Mosaic law, right? According to this right here, those are the people that you need to take care of. So that thinking factored into this society's thought as well too, right? Really important.
So I would just say, yes, when it's the Christian value, it seems to me
Sure.
that we really do have to take seriously that vulnerability piece.
Yep.
Right?
Absolutely.
And we're not as likely to do that in the American context because of our emphasis upon personal achievement, people earning their livelihood, blah blah blah. Right? We're just much more oriented toward achievement than we are toward
Yes.
vulnerability.
Yes.
And so there's this great fear that we're going to, well, back to the parenting thing.
Yep.
Are we going to disrupt people's development by being too generous to them because they're vulnerable? And so this whole thing with, I'm very interested in how victimhood or perception of victimhood is becomes so prevalent in our culture, and whether or not there's true vulnerability there, in that assumption of victimhood because someone claims it. So anyway, I think the Christian factor is to err on the side of compassion, and yet to ask ourselves, do we need to interdict with more tough love?
Yes.
Than just, oh, sweetie, that's okay.
There are some Christians that I can't believe they make the statements that they do in this society that we live in. And you say you're a Christian?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is a struggle.
It is.
And it's
What you said about forgiveness today was really, really grand.
yeah, it's tough. Yeah, it's really tough. Well, you made me think of something. I'm reading a book and I can't think of the title of it right now, but it's when I get done with it, perhaps we'll look at it. It's a book that explores the concept that the people of Israel, the number one thing that defines who they are is the trauma that they experienced, right? So it's essentially a trauma-informed reading of the Old Testament. Absolutely fascinating book. When I remember the name of it, I'll let you know. I'm super bad with that stuff. I forgot where I was going, and apologies. I get so preachy sometimes, but.
Well, no, I guess it seems to me you're pushing us in a direction here.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, okay. And
Not very subtly,
not
either.
but it's okay. I'm just asking us, to appreciate how complex this
Yes.
is, right?
Yeah, and let me go ahead. Sorry.
But along the way to have again a hermeneutic, some principles of interpretation that we can live with and be at peace with.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But the thing I'm very much appreciating about just the last few weeks that you're talking is that there is no just naked text. Okay, it does come in a context that we need to understand. It does come with a set of lenses that we bring to it, and the honesty, the humility that we bring to it is absolutely crucial.
Yes.
We can't just say, well, I know what this means. It simply is that.
Yes. And, well, thank you. Yeah, and we stated this at the beginning of the class, and I shouldn't repeat it every week, is that one of my goals, and this is my goal, it doesn't have to be your goal, but one of my goals in walking through this stuff as well is specifically wrestling with this stuff that seems to carry so much weight in our cultural Christianity, but we never ever really look at it. I mean, how many of us, myself included, right, think, oh yeah, that's in the weird Levitical law somewhere, right? And when I was reading through this stuff, I was actually shocked with the things that I thought that were in there that weren't, and the things that were in there that I didn't know were in there, right? And I've read through this stuff before. So one of my goals is to get us to at least do the uncomfortable work of wrestling with it a little bit, but also shaping how, well, okay, let me go back to something as a way of moving on as well too. Vulnerability. The Bible, I should say, the Mosaic law, the Levitical law, the people of Israel had categories that they defined as being, these are the vulnerable people in our society. Again, it's a little bit more fluid than this, but generally widows, orphans, strangers, foreigners, right? Okay. There are reasons for that. Has a lot to do with the legal code itself, right? Women, at least in that society, were an underclass. And again, we're beating a dead horse to a certain extent, but there were reasons why these were the protected classes, is because they were the vulnerable classes, not just because of the law, but because of also how the world worked. Okay? Here's something I encourage us to think about. Who are the vulnerable in our context? And we already talked about how one of the assumptions that our society holds is that children are vulnerable. Absolutely true. Infants are vulnerable. The unborn are vulnerable. All these things are true. In the Hebrew context, it was also people who were vulnerable because of who they were as well, right? Not just because of the inalienable things like age, right? But also, the strangers were considered vulnerable, which was not necessarily a prescriptive thing. It was describing one of the realities of living in the ancient world, which was that it was dangerous to leave your homeland, right? As soon as you left the boundaries of your homeland, you were no longer protected by the law. And to go from, you weren't taking vacations in Babylon as an Israelite, right? You weren't going to Egypt to see the pyramids on a regular basis. You couldn't go to if you were from the tribe of Benjamin or from the tribe of Gad, right? You weren't necessarily going to go visit somebody in Judah. Well, Judah was going to be here, but one of the other ones. That's what the book of Judges is about. It's trying to make travel between tribes a little bit safer, amongst other things. That's really not that's an awful joke. But that, okay, this is considered a vulnerable part of the population. The laws, the Levitical, the Mosaic laws are intended to protect these people, so much so that we get some of the strongest language that comes out saying, you yourselves were slaves in a foreign land, therefore, let this influence how you treat foreigners. Who might be considered vulnerable in our context by a similar reading of our context, right? So the people who are not necessarily protected by our legal codes, but are vulnerable because of culture, right? That are vulnerable. And you could make arguments. Immigrants, refugees, right? Not that far of a jump from the stranger, right? In a biblical setting. I just listened to an episode of This American Life talking about, did you know that the majority of people who are smuggling migrants across the U.S. border are teenagers? Yes. You know why? Because they can't be prosecuted in the U.S. So up until you are 18, the way that our legal system works, if you get caught smuggling people across the border, they hold you overnight and send you back home. So much so that it has become an entire culture of 15 through 17-year-olds who are making hundreds of dollars per trip, like an amazing amount of money, doing the work of smuggling. And they're on Instagram showing, taking pics. I mean, I'm not making this stuff up. They are tweeting pictures of themselves crossing the border with 50 people swimming the river, going over the fence. It's branding, man. It's branding. But I'll finish this thought. But then, what about these folks that end up now strangers in a strange land, not protected, right, necessarily by our legal system, and having no resources, no recourse? If they get caught, it's an entirely different process. They themselves, who might be fleeing violence in their homeland, and if they get sent back to their homeland. And again, I'm not necessarily encouraging us to have an extremely deep and nuanced conversation about immigration policy, but I'm inviting us to have an imagination about what vulnerability means in a modern context and what we might think about with regards to who from a Christian understanding, who we should encourage our law to protect, right? We have, in Portland, Ukrainian refugees are being resettled here, right? We have refugees from Afghanistan that are being resettled here. Would you hope that the biblical law would protect these folks? Yeah, right? That one's a little bit easier to sink our teeth into. Crip camp. Yeah. Oh, great. And by the way, nowhere in the biblical law is there a conversation around the differently abled. Do you know why? Because they did not survive to adulthood. Right? So think about that as well, too. Right? Nowhere in the biblical witness are there exceptions or rules or codes regarding the differently abled. Okay? Because it was assumed they were not going to survive to adulthood. Does that mean that Hebrew families were killing children with Down syndrome? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe families, especially families with more money, were able to take care of those children and allow them to live as long as they were able to. However, it is important that we understand that those things don't exist in there. The Americans with Disabilities Act, coming out of that movie I talked about last week, right? Wonderful piece of legislation, but we tend to assume that that's kind of part of our cultural ethics. But it wouldn't necessarily be a biblically based one, at least according to the Mosaic Law. Now, I would argue I could justify it 5 ways from Sunday in a reading of Jesus' words, right? But this is, sorry, and I'm really belaboring a point here, but again, these are people that we define as being vulnerable, deserving of special exemption and protection within our codified system. What does that mean, right? And how do we support that? Because I think it's very important that we support, as people of faith, we support the protection and the care of people who are differently able. Right? Okay, Jim, you were going to say something.
It was answered.
Okay,
I have an interjection.
go.
I read on the internet this morning, Florida has been devastated.
Mm-hmm.
Who's going down there to help rebuild it? Migrant farmers.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And they're afraid that they're going to be deported if they get caught down there.
Yes. Yeah, this is Florida.
Yeah.
That statement carries some weight. And keep in mind that my general dislike of Florida has nothing to do with politics. It's simply that Florida is a swamp. I'm fair-skinned, don't like heat nor moisture. So, or alligators, crocodiles, or any of the other creeping, crawling beasts that live south of Mason Dixon line. It's just not my jam. Okay, so read that. God bless the people of Florida. I'm sure it's wonderful.
That affects your ethics too.
What's that?
That affects your ethics.
It does.
I think, voting about any policies has all these things involved in it.
Mm-hmm.
No, I really don't like south of the Mason-Dixon line.
Yeah.
Therefore,
Absolutely.
gosh, a hurricane comes through, let them
Absolutely.
fend for themselves.
Absolutely.
It's the challenge of the word of God to us is always, oh my gosh.
Are you able to think and imagine beyond your own personal worldview?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You've never lived in Texas.
Yeah. Intentionally, I have never lived in
I was
Texas.
born here. It was not my
And again,
fault.
were I born and raised in Texas, I'm sure I would have a much different perspective. Despite my Scandinavian heritage, I do tan somewhat. I would have adapted. I may have moved out of there as fast as I possibly could for cooler climes, but and my life would be different had I been born somewhere else. I was born in Northeast Michigan, where if it gets above 80 degrees, it's the end of the world. I mean, guaranteed the humidity is also above the 80s as well too, which adds a whole different complication. But good Lord, I'm a little snowflake. I could not survive in the
Sorry,
sun.
108 degree with 98% humidity.
Nope, no, I don't want to try, Carolyn. I do not want to try. Okay, I'm enjoying myself talking too much. Okay, if someone leaves, that's verse 33. We'll round this out. If someone leaves a pit open, I love this. This is so funny. Interesting, not funny. If someone leaves a pit open or digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution, giving money to its owner, but keeping the dead animal. This is one of the things that I get a kick out of here is that what you're actually doing is you're paying the blood price for the animal. You're paying market value for that ox or donkey or whatever falls in here. It's not a punishment, it's a restitution, right? Another thing that we need to keep in mind when we read this stuff is we're reading it through the lens that the intent of this is not necessarily to punish the person who was involved in the wrongdoing. It's to make restitution for the wrong that has been done. Does that make sense? Okay. Property, parenthetically, restitution. Okay. When someone steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, the the thief shall pay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. The thief shall make the restitution, but if unable to do so, shall be sold for the theft. When the animal, whether ox or donkey or sheep, is found alive in the thief's possession, the thief shall pay double. So why, if it's an act of perhaps ignorance, you dug a pit, you forgot to cover it, an ox gets killed, you just buy the ox. Why in the case of theft is there a multiplication of the fine?
Intention.
Yeah, I wonder if that's it.
Also, I think it's always, I believe this to be true, that those who are privileged to make the law have an assumption that this is a multiple offense.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
we just caught you this time, but
We know you. This isn't your first rodeo. This isn't your first ox theft. So Paul was saying, yeah, there's also a kind of assumption, especially in those who have never had to resort to thievery, that this is the time we caught them. So perhaps by having them pay the cost of 5 oxen, we're making up for the times that we didn't catch them. Yeah, I think intent factors in there as well. Probably also discouragement, right? Discouraging that behavior, which is why you will find in all other cultures and other codes of law even more severe punishment. So I don't know if it's still true, but it used to be in Singapore you get the hand chopped off for theft. Lashings for spitting in the street, that kind of stuff, which isn't necessarily about making up for the harm that has been done, is discouraging others from continuing that.
So I'm going to
Twist away. Twist and shout.
Okay, so what happens if you're digging a pit and your neighbor forgot to lock his cow up in the fence?
Oh, good
and
Lord.
The cow comes over, it's not your fault. You figured the cow was in the pen. So you're digging, you go up to get a drink of water, you come back and find the cow in the pit. Should you be punished because your neighbor forgot to close the gate?
I love this. I love this. This is the kind of imagination that we need to have here. Because I guarantee you, Linda, that there are magistrates in Israel that heard this exact same argument every day of their lives. This is what the life of a judge in Israel looks like. is this exact scenario. I may have left the pit uncovered, but if Bob had locked his pen like he's supposed to do, that cow is always getting out. Goes over into my lawn, eats my grass. If he had locked it like he should have done years ago, you can hear this. I love it. If a thief is found breaking in, and is this the castle doctrine here? And is found beaten to death. Verse 2. 22:2. If a thief is found breaking in and is beaten to death, no blood guilt is incurred. But if it happens after sunrise, blood guilt is incurred.
What?
What's going on here?
Funny things.
Okay, can I tell you what I think? Yeah, I'm going to tell you anyways. Generally speaking, when does thievery happen? At sunrise? It happens at night. So I think what the scenario is a thief is found breaking in, is imprisoned, right? Perhaps, I don't know, tortured, and then thrown out into the street. I don't know. I don't know. I'm working an idea here, and now I realize it doesn't sound good. I don't know. Anybody got any ideas here? What if it happens after sunrise? So it's okay to break in daylight, but not during the night?
That's what I was thinking.
Daylight thievery, A-okay, according to the Mosaic Law.
Well, you go back to 22:1 maybe, we are talking the restitution piece, right?
Yeah, that's true.
That's just make even. So there's only a couple of places where it's talking about thief as being a bad thing, like thou shalt not steal stuff.
It's perceived harm, is what it is. It's perceived harm. Somebody breaks into your house in the middle of the night. Are you more likely to do violence to them if they walk into your house in the middle of the day?
When you know who they are, you see them.
And during the day? Yeah.
At night you don't know who it is. You may be after, in a battle or something.
That's what I'm saying. I wonder if that's the piece of it here, is that they're making an exception for somebody, whose sanctity is broken at nighttime. I'll be honest. If I hear suspicious noises in my house during the night, I'm going for the knife drawer, even though that's a measured bad idea, right? Just get out of the situation. I'm kind of speaking off the cuff here, but if somebody walks into my house in the middle of the day, I'm more likely to call the local nursing home to figure out if does that make sense? I think that's maybe what's happening here.
It takes a while to light a candle in the middle of the night.
Because I think what they're saying is that if it happens during the day, there's a sense of premeditation to it, whereas if a thief breaks in at night, it's Casper doctrine, it's reaction or whatever. So I shouldn't use Casper doctrine.
No, I think it's fair. I think, we take for granted that there's always been high pressure sodium bulbs.
Yeah.
It's not true.
Yeah. What time is it? 12:20. Okay, 5 more minutes, and then I got it. Okay. When someone causes a field or a vineyard to be grazed over, or lets its here's the answer to your question, Linda, or lets livestock loose to graze in someone else's field, restitution shall be made from the best in the owner's field or vineyard. Okay, so what happens now if that animal who happened to be grazing in somebody else's field walks into the pit that you had dug back there? Is that perhaps a solid deterrent to people who let their I don't know. When fire breaks out and catches in thorns so that the stacked grain or the standing grain of the field is consumed, the one who started the fire shall make full restitution. Yeah, how do you figure that out? Eagle Creek fire, anybody? Yeah. When someone delivers to a neighbor money or goods for safekeeping and they are stolen from the neighbor's house, then the thief, if caught, shall pay double. Oh, poor thief. If the thief is not caught, the owner of the house shall be brought before God to determine whether or not the owner had laid hands on the neighbor's goods. So there seems to be an assumption that if things get stolen while you're watching over them, that it's actually on the watcher-over's responsibility to prove that they did not take it for themselves. I wonder what happened behind the scenes here. right? I wonder if there were a rash of people entrusted with goods and the goods were stolen, right, to make this law. In any case of disputed ownership involving ox, donkey, sheep, clothing, or any other loss, of which one party says, "This is mine," the case of both parties shall come before God. The one whom God condemns shall pay double to the other. So this is literally a double jeopardy scenario. Or not double jeopardy. Double or nothing. I don't know.
Could you describe what you believe it means to come before God?
I wonder if it's still, if this is kind of like reinforcing, this is the come before the altar
But in the
and make
footnote,
confession.
It says are before the judges.
In your footnote, come before the judge.
In the footnote of the Bible, it says are before the judges.
Is that, what does the note say? Does it say that's in other versions? It says this?
After the word God, there's an X. And down at the bottom it says are before the judges.
It doesn't say why it says that. It just says the text.
I think that means that that's a probably either a disputed translation or in some versions, this.
Yeah, maybe disputed. It doesn't indicate.
Well, bridging on what Paul was bringing up there seems to be a precedent that's being established, which is in cases where we cannot, through easy manner, right, suss out the truth, there is a mechanism by which you come before God to make confession, and that there is a mechanism therein where something happens. This is actually a good place to leave us with, to wonder about as we go into next week, because this is going to come up very importantly once we get into the social, religious, family stuff. Well, I don't want to ask too leading a question, but what is the significance of the idea of when our legal mechanisms, in this case, cannot prove righteousness or unrighteousness, right or wrong, that ultimately the final authority in the matter seems to be the divine, right? Second part of that question, does that same thought still exist for us? When you go up on the witness stand, what do? Or the Constitution? You swear. Yeah. What is the implied thing here? If you're putting your hand on a Bible and swearing on it, what's the implication here? The implication is that there is some sense of existential threat in lying before God. And that by having somebody, ponder that they're more likely to tell the truth. Would you say that in 2022 that is more or less effective as a deterrent? Yeah, I don't know. I bet for some folks who go up on the witness stand, that definitely reinforces for them the significance of what they're about to partake in. And I bet for a lot of folks, does not cause one bit of anxiety. Do you think this is similar or different to folks in this context? Do you think that there were people who once fled to the altar and had zero concern for the divine repercussions of the falsehoods they were about to speak? Yep. Boy, we're a cynical people. Anyways, okay, thank you, folks. Thank you very much for the conversation today. I apologize for going off on my rants. I'll try to rein them in a little bit. But, yeah.
You were asking about Egypt, or you were saying you didn't know about the law codes of Egypt?
Mm-hmm.
I looked it up over the weekend. So, you will be able to read a bunch of stuff about how Egypt's laws work. But the reason why you don't know any of the law codes is because we have none of it.
That's what I figured.
It just does not.
Yeah. So we have anecdotal stuff that references how it functioned, but
Blame the fire in Alexandria.
Blame the fire in Alexandria, just like the rains down in Africa.
It also depends right now, what are you living in?
Now it does, absolutely, yeah.